The thing about wars is that like they don't really consider what to do after the war. Everyone always just thinks like, oh, we gotta end the war, and when it came to the Civil War, Lincoln did think far enough ahead about what would happen after the war, and he had a plan that was called like it was called Reconstruction, and his plan for it was called the 10% plan. And the first step of his plan was he was gonna have a tenth of every state's pre-war voters, as in like people who were there before the war, if they took an oath of loyalty to the government, then they could establish their state government. And Lincoln, he didn't want to like make make this be like the blueprint for the post-war, but he wanted to just make sure that the Confederacy was weakened to reunite the Union. And shortly after this, the Wade Davis bill was proposed to try and delay the formation of these state governments. But Lincoln, he vetoed this because he wanted things to happen like how he wanted them to happen. He didn't want them to be changed. And some Republicans thought that like he was gonna give former slaves equal rights, and they were not okay with this. And in Lincoln's last speech, he actually said he viewed a lot of black people to be very intelligent, and that the ones who served in the Union Army, he would go as far to say that they should be able to vote. Lincoln was never able to see any of his plans through because he was assassinated, and when he was assassinated, Andrew Johnson took over. After Johnson took over, he began the period of presidential reconstruction, which started in 1865 and lasted like around 2 years. And in this period of presidential reconstruction, he offered a pardon to all Southern white people except for Confederate leaders and wealthy planters. And eventually, these men would get their their political rights back and their property, but not their slaves. That was like a very clear part of his Reconstruction plan. They would not get slavery in any way. And along with this, there were some new requirements they had, which was slavery would be completely abolished, as I said. They also were going to pretty much just ignore their secession from the Union, and they wanted to give them a hand in managing like government affairs and stuff. And the way a lot of these new, or not new, but a lot of these Southern whites who got their rights back responded was by enacting the Black Codes. And these were laws that made African Americans sign yearly labor contracts, and it basically put them a slight level above slavery. It wasn't much better, and a lot of African Americans resisted the implementation of these policies, but they couldn't really do a lot about them, and neither did Johnson.
The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 divided the South into 5 different military districts. This ended up starting the period of radical Reconstruction in the United States of America. The Reconstruction lasted until 1877, which was when Southern Republican governments disbanded from the Union. When they disbanded, that meant that they completely separated from the United States of America and wanted to live alone. By the year 1870, every Confederate state was admitted back into the Union, making them part of the United States again. Almost all of these states were being ran by Republican powers, which had heavy influence on the civilians living inside of these states. Also, African Americans were very dominant in these areas because these were very slave populated areas pre-Civil War. Because of the abnormal amount of African American dominance, this was very new to America and caused fear in many pro-slavery citizens. Blacks in these Republican states viewed freedom as being free from white control. African Americans began fighting for economic freedom as they were getting used to religious freedom and being on their own. They wanted more. This upset many white Southerners, which is what ultimately caused a lot of conflict within these states. The radical Republicans began to fight back and had the same morals and ideas as past slave owners during the Civil War and before the Civil War. These Republicans increased tensions during the Reconstruction. Many radical groups formed to go against African Americans, and than change America. A lot of these groups were extremely violent and wanted to put an end to the protests African Americans were constructing. Southern Republicanism was made up of three different groups. The first group were carpetbaggers, the second group was scallywags, and the third group were native-born white Americans. These native-born white Americans were the main group out of the three that would set prejudice upon African Americans living in these southern states. Different things that this group would do to the African Americans were setting discrimination laws. These laws were very similar that to the laws placed during segregation several years ago upon black people. For example, public transportation laws. Many African Americans were not allowed to ride in the same train, bus, or carriage as other white folk. Another way these native-born white Republicans in these southern states fought against black people and their ideologies were by setting up different white supremacy radical groups. One of these very popular and well-known radical groups is the KKK, also known as the Ku Klux Klan.
The Ku Klux Klan was a racist organization which started in 1865 in the American South. By 1870, it had become a prominent organization throughout the entirety of the American South. The KKK at the time was a radical organization which opposed Republicans and all their ideals. In addition to this, they are a white supremacist group who terrorized African Americans after the end of the Civil War and after the end of slavery as well. Black schools, churches, and institutions were all targets of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was essentially a terrorist group which sought out white supremacy. The rights that African Americans were given immediately following the Civil War, such as the right to vote, were often challenged by the KKK as well. For example, the KKK would intimidate and threaten African Americans when they would attempt to vote. Black politicians and legislators were often intimidated by the KKK as well.